Hello class, this will be another narrated PowerPoint presentation that I'll post on YouTube. This is for CRJ 2010, the Intro to Terrorism Studies class. Next slide. This week we're going to discuss Chapter 11, Homeland Security, a very important topic within the field of terrorism studies. In fact, we actually have I have a separate course that I teach, both in a lecture and an online format. I highly recommend that whether you're a terrorism minor student or just somebody that's interested, that you take this class. Number one, Homeland Security is a very critical topic, not only for those that work in the field of Homeland Security, but for all criminal justice professionals. It's also a field where there's quite a large number of employment opportunities for people that are interested. And so I would highly recommend, and when we're talking about Homeland Security, it's a relatively new concept in the modern political and security environment that has existed since the September 11th, 2001 attacks. And you'll see how our society, and in particular our government, has reacted with new policies addressing Homeland Security. And those are some of the things that we'll talk about. We'll put it in perspective. We'll focus on the United States. And in the end of this chapter, we'll talk a little bit about perspective. And remember, Homeland Security itself, the department that we'll talk about, was created in essentially in an evolution, in a response to the new threat from terrorism, not only from the international terrorists, but also from our own homegrown threat. Next slide. Let's just take a look again. Homeland Security, protect the American people from terrorist threats. We'll talk about the threat from homegrown jihadists or Islamic fundamentalists. And of course, they're not the only homegrown threat we face. We also face it from other individuals with different goals and objectives, extremists who use violence in furtherance of their cause. And we've talked about several of those in our course so far this semester. We'll look at crisis in Homeland Security. Look at the Office of Homeland Security. And actually, the Office of Homeland Security and Homeland Security Council was established by President Bush on October 8, 2001. And this is within 30 days, approximately 30 days after the 9/11 attacks. And ultimately, the Homeland Security Act was passed shortly after that, and that created the Department of Homeland Security. I don't know if they mentioned this in the textbook, but that was the largest reorganization of government since 1947 with the National Security Act, where organization called the Department of Defense was formed. And it's important to remember when discussing Homeland Security that it really is our number one priority, is to protect the American people, but we also must be very adaptable as we face changing threat scenarios. Next slide. Just a slide to give you some examples of the threat. We have the Times Square bomber, who fortunately in this case the bomb did not detonate, but you can see where with the schematic there of the vehicle itself, where the explosives were placed. And think of the devastation of an attack like this. A vehicle borne improvised explosive device could do in a place like Times Square, where there's so many people and businesses, etc. You also have a picture of the anthrax letters. That's one of the letters that went to Senator Daschle, which resulted in 5 deaths. 5 grams. The fear that went through the United States at the time, I can really appreciate this because I was the U.S. Postal Inspector on the international security team at that point. We were dealing with anti-terrorism issues and terrorism issues as an agency, and I just know that with these 5 letters that went out and the individuals that were killed, several of them being postal employees, the fear that spread throughout the country, but not only the country but internationally. I actually had to fly to Trinidad and address the the postal employees down there because they were afraid of trickle-down anthrax attaching to letters that were being processed with the other letters that contained the anthrax, which of course the risk of that was very, very minimal, but they had refused to work. So I know I went down there and I appeared at a forum along with a medical doctor, and we tried to convince them that their exposure threat was very, very, very minimal, and we were able to do that and get them back to work. But this is just an idea of how fear can spread not only domestically but also internationally when you see something like this. People are always afraid of biological threats, and the anthrax letters was no different. There's also a picture of Major Hassan, who was the terrorist that killed the soldiers in Fort Hood, Texas. Again, he was a homegrown jihadi. We'll talk about him again a little bit later. But just, he was born to Palestinian parents. He was a major serving as a psychiatrist in the U.S. Army at the time of the attack. And these, now the anthrax letters themselves, that investigation is I'm not going to go into it, but it was not a jihadist who was a suspect in that case. The primary suspect who committed suicide was actually a scientist that was working at an Army lab in Maryland. Next slide. Okay, this slide is titled "The Threat from Homegrown Jihadist Crisis and Homeland Security." And we'll talk about a few events here. The picture that you see in this slide is the Madrid bombing that occurred in 2004. As a matter of fact, it occurred on March the 11th of 2004, where 10 bombs exploded on commuter trains, and three of them did not explode, so they had actually placed 13 bombs. They were placed in backpacks. They all exploded within 20 minutes. So it shows the coordination among the terror group in carrying out this attack. 191 people were killed, thousands, that were. I can't give you an exact total of how many were injured, but you got to figure hundreds more were injured in the attack. Very devastating attack in Spain. And what's interesting on this also was this was carried out by a sleeper cell of Al-Qaeda affiliated individuals, many of them Moroccans. The Abu Hatzal al-Masri Brigade is what they called themselves, and their motivation for this attack was, at the time, Spain was a strong supporter of the Iraq invasion and had provided troops that were serving alongside Americans and British troops in Iraq. And this particular attack occurred within several days or within a short time period of an election that was occurring in the country. And when it turned out that they carried it out to try to stop the Spanish from participating in the Iraq War effort, apparently the inclusion of Spanish troops was not popular within the population, but when they found out that this bombing was in retaliation for that, the terrorists really had somewhat of a political win here, because what happened was the current prime minister who had supported the coalition in Iraq was defeated, handily defeated, and the new prime minister was elected on one of his platforms was, "I'm going to get all the Spanish troops out of Iraq," and within a few days all the troops were withdrawn. So in effect, the Spanish in this case caved in to the demands of the terrorists through this attack. One way to look at it. I'm sure they might look at it differently. We also had the London transportation system attack, and these were carried out by like-minded Islamist jihadists that were homegrown. They were a British-based cell, so they came from British citizens that were probably second, third generation Muslims. There were 4 bombs. 3 of them exploded on the subway, one in a double-decker bus, like a tourist bus that you'll see in London if you ever get a chance to visit there. They were suicide bombers, and Again, another very devastating attack. The other incident we talk about, I mentioned briefly before, occurred on November the 5th of 2009, where we had 13 soldiers were killed and 29 wounded. A shooting that was led by Major Hassan. He's a psychiatrist. Again, like I said before, he was born in Virginia. He was a Palestinian. His parents were Palestinian. He was a devout Muslim. He had been influenced by a known Al-Qaeda terrorist by the name of Anwar al-Awlaki. I think we've talked about him in this class before. And he had actually given out some warning signals. The Army, I think, when they look at this and they look back on it, he had made statements that he opposed the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it was a holy war against Muslims, and he had done this in front of his colleagues in prepared remarks. So somebody should have picked up on this, you would think, within the Department of the Army, or at least reported him, but it didn't happen, and as a result, an attack which the current administration calls workplace violence, but most textbooks and many other professionals within the field call this a terrorist attack, just based on his background, etc. So these are examples of the threat that we do face, not only here in the United States, but also abroad from homegrown jihadists in this case. Jihadists being, we've talked about jihad, so you know what that means. Next slide. Now, if you look at that, we've all heard about condition red, high, elevated. This is the threat level matrix that's used by the United States when they feel like there's a significant risk of a terrorist attack, or a high risk, or an attack is imminent. In particular, in areas where you have a high concentration of potential targets, like Washington, D.C., or even locally here, Fort Bragg, you'll see the risk level go up. The European context, they don't have an organizational setup like we have with the Department of Homeland Security. They didn't, and they've been facing terrorist violence for many years prior to 9/11, with groups like the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, the Red Brigade, the Red Army faction, and other groups, and nationalist spillovers from around the globe that have carried out attacks in Europe. And they focus their efforts on cross-ministry, in the sense that different ministries within their governments have responsibility for security and prevention and protecting their own homeland. They operate within the existing structure that they have. They didn't go through the wholesale changes like we did. Now, if you look at the American context prior to 9/11, and this is something I'm going to talk about as we progress in this slide presentation, we suffered from interagency challenges. In other words, organizations not working together, not sharing information, and as a result, we can't quote the famous word as connect the dots, or nobody really sees the big picture. Everybody has a lot of little pictures, but if nobody's sharing that information, then you have things like 9/11 that can occur. And then we also have a renewed focus on intelligence and prevention, which we didn't have prior to 9/11, not to the extent that we needed to have. We were much more reactive. In other words, a crime occurs and we investigate it from a law enforcement perspective. Now, the FBI did have some overseas liaisons that were in place at our embassies for foreign international coordination, and which ultimately is the protection of the homeland. But from a policy perspective, these challenges and these failures did have a major impact, and of course had an impact on our homeland security. Next slide. This is a good slide taken straight out of the book, and it kind of gives you an indication of, in Table 11.1, where our organizational structures were prior to September 11th relative to homeland security. We didn't have a central coordination. Again, it was almost more like the European model. We had different agencies with different responsibilities, and And of course, what can happen, as we know, is when you don't have good coordination, then things can fall through the cracks. So, for example, there are some changes that were made and some that weren't made. Let's just take a look at a couple of them. You can read this for yourself. If you look at the table 11.1, the one on the left, you look at the CIA. It's an independent agency. Its mission is the collection and analysis of foreign intelligence. Something important to remember, which I've mentioned in this class before. The CIA has no domestic authority. They're not a law enforcement organization. They're an intelligence agency. They collect information and they analyze it and develop intelligence. Again, their enforcement authority, no domestic. Now we look at the Coast Guard. Parent organization prior to 9/11 was the Department of Transportation, protection of U.S. waterways, domestic law enforcement authority. Now let's scoot over to the right at table 11.2, and let's compare the Coast Guard to where they were and where they are now. Now they're part of the Department of Homeland Security. Their new directorate is Border and Transportation Security, and their new directive duty is coordination of all national entry points. So the Coast Guard, which is a very interesting organization, a very well-respected professional organization, now under the new rules, or their new organizational structure, not only do they protect the waterways, but they also have a lot of border and transportation and homeland security responsibilities. One of the words you won't see in this textbook that they talk about is, that we talk about in the Homeland Security classes, a term called mission distortion. And this is where, because of bureaucratic reorganization, missions no longer really know what their what their priorities are, and they suffer. Should I protect the waterway, or am I out here to stop from terrorists entering our country through our borders? So these are things that can emerge whenever you have wholesale changes. Let's look at the FBI, Department of Justice. They investigate and monitor criminal and national security threats. They have domestic law enforcement authority. And if you look at their role under the new structure, there's no change. They were not incorporated into the Department of Homeland Security. They remain within the Department of Justice. So some agencies like the CIA and the FBI, they maintained their organizational structure. But then other organizations did have to change. One of the big ones is Immigration and Naturalization Service. And that's our Border Patrol, our ICE agents, Immigration Customs Enforcement, Transportation Security Administration, etc. So that just kind of gives you and one of the reasons this change took place was a lack of coordination. The policymakers felt that 9/11, if there was one major lesson learned from 9/11, it was the lack of coordination between agencies that should be involved in protecting the homeland. Next slide. What are the challenges that we face? If you look at the small picture here, we have like the barbed wire between the CIA and the FBI. Not a lot of love lost between those two agencies, especially prior to 9/11. They really didn't trust each other from an organizational perspective, and as a result, collaboration of information and intelligence was not a priority within these agencies. And then what happens is you have situations that emerge where perhaps if collaboration would have been better, certain things might not have happened. This is not to predict that 9/11 wouldn't have happened even had they been collaborating. It's just a weakness that was found when the 9/11 Commission studied the 9/11 attack and made recommendations. You also have entrenched bureaucracies, and that is administrative people within organizations that like the way things are and do not like to change. When you have no central coordination of intelligence, and that's what you have. You have different, you can't connect the dots. You can't see the entire strategic picture when people aren't cooperating with each other. And again, probably the best example of that would be the turf conflict. What we mean by turf is the FBI versus the CIA. They didn't want to exchange information because of the interdepartmental conflict between the bureaucracies, and their different roles as they perceive them. Next slide. What were some of the key actions to improve Homeland Security? Well, in 2002, they created the Department of Homeland Security, and we're going to take a look at that task organizational structure here in a minute. And then the 9/11 Commission report identified many of the weaknesses that they felt needed to be changed, and these things were addressed in some of the legislation that follows that I'll mention. And then I think one of the greatest things that came out of all this was the creation of the National Counterterrorism Center, which is a central focal point organization where all the different intelligence agencies have a seat, and where collaboration is not only encouraged but required. So if you work with one of the intelligence agencies with the military, if you walk into that building, you'll have the military there. You'll have all the different federal law enforcement agencies, from FBI, ATF, postal inspectors, DEA, to organizations like the CIA, NSA. All these folks have a place in this National Counterterrorism Center, and their focus, of course, is to protect the homeland. So that was an organization that was created to have a major impact on collaboration. Next slide. So what are some of the things that have occurred? Obviously, it's up to the legislature to create laws, and so we have laws that adapted to the new threat environment. The USA Patriot Act of 2001, major piece of legislation that addressed many of the problems that had occurred as a result of 9/11 that were identified. And these laws are again done to adapt to this new terrorist environment. And if you look at the Patriot Act, you saw revisions of the standards for government surveillance. On page 243, they discuss this. The use of roving wiretaps by investigators, which permit surveillance of an individual's telephone conversations on any phone. As we know with today's cell phone world, the bad guy, he can buy 5 or 10 cell phones. He can use one for an hour and then throw it in a trash can and go to another one. Well, it's impractical for law enforcement to be expected to have to get a new search warrant every time a different phone is used. So by the use of roving wiretaps, you can actually get a warrant on that individual, and no matter how many telephones that person uses, and no matter where else in the country, you only need one warrant to cover all of that, rather than have to get an individual warrant for each one. There was also strengthened requirements for banks to identify money to being sourced, and what they're looking at here is terrorist funding, the use of nationwide search warrants, where I can get a warrant in Washington, D.C., and if I'm following a terrorist and I need to execute a warrant in California, I can do that. So a lot of these things were to cut some of the administrative red tape. Also, the deportation of immigrants who raise money for terrorist organizations if they're identified when they come into this country. Also, you'll notice that the U.S. Patriot Act is, and this was probably a smart thing to do, it was renewed in 2005, reauthorization in 2005. It was actually renewed in 2006. And what this does is it takes a look at the law 5 years after it was passed to see what changes need to be made, what enhancements, or if they need to pull back on some of the authorizations they had provided for potential abuse. And these are discussed on page 243 as well. And you have the Anti-Terrorism Death Penalty Act, which made terrorism a death penalty case, and made laws such as placing taggants in plastic explosives and even fertilizer in some cases, where if somebody uses those particular items in an explosion, these taggants are identification marks, and we can track it back to the manufacturer, and obviously all the way back to the business that might have sold the materials to a terrorist when he was preparing his bomb. And it also identified the Secretary of State as the individual that's responsible for designating foreign terrorist organizations. On this particular slide, we take a look at the organizational chart for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Let me just focus on a few of the items. If you look at the bottom list, those are kind of your major organizations that do a lot of the work. We go on the bottom there, TSA, Transportation Security Administration. And they're responsible, obviously you've probably run into the TSA agents at the airport, but they also get involved in freight and mail responsibilities as well. A very important organization. Sometimes that's our first line of defense. But again, their job is to protect our nation's transportation systems. You have U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and what we're talking about, they're responsible to protect our nation's borders in order to prevent terrorists and terrorist weapons from entering the United States while facilitating the flow of legitimate trade and travel. And so that's your Border Patrol and your ICE agents, and of course the Immigration's Customs Enforcement agents. They get involved if individuals actually get across the border within the country, then they would be the ones that would be responsible for tracking those people down. That's your U.S. Immigration Customs Enforcement organization, which is in the center there. And let's look over FEMA, and you ask yourself, why is FEMA involved here? Well, FEMA is responsible for preparing the nation for hazards, manage response and recovery efforts following any national incident. So not only do they help respond to hurricanes like Katrina and other natural disasters, but they also, if we had a major terrorist attack in the country like we had with 9/11, they would also be involved in helping respond and recover from the devastation caused by the attack. And I've also already mentioned the Coast Guard briefly, but their job is to protect the public, the environment, U.S. economic interest, and our ports and waterways along our coast. So if you look at this organization, it's a large organization. I think I mentioned earlier, 240,000 employees. Many of the agencies are described on 245 and page 246, so take a look at that. And they also have like science and technology, where they look at new technologies that can be used to support the mission of protecting the homeland. They have an intelligence and an analysis division, health affairs, when we look at national health. So there's the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center comes under Homeland Security. So if you become a federal agent, there's only a few agencies that don't use FLETC. I think the FBI has their own agency. The postal inspectors have their own academy, but many of the agencies, you'll at least attend the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center for your basic training. That's located down in Glencoe, Georgia, outside of Savannah. So these are just a good schematic diagram of all the different agencies and just the mere size of this organization, as you can imagine. It is a major bureaucracy. Next slide. Areas of responsibility, again, guard against terrorism, secure the borders, enforce our immigration laws, improve our readiness, our response and recovery from disasters, and mature as an organization and unify the new department. It's a relatively young organization now. It's been in existence since 2002, which is now, 13 years? Not very long for an agency. And I'm sure there's a lot of growing pains that go with that as they've adapted. And especially, money's not unlimited. There was a lot of money thrown at the organization when it was first created, but I'm sure that that's much more difficult today. Next slide. Homeland Security agencies, and I've discussed some of them already. We also have some sector-specific agencies. Let me just mention a couple of them. Department of Agriculture, well, what's their responsibility? Well, all these agencies have responsibilities relative to critical infrastructure within the country. And obviously, Department of Agriculture would be to protect our food supply and make sure that our food supply is secure. Department of Defense, their job is to deter war and protect the homeland through the use of our military resources. They also have assets that they must protect: our military bases, our defense facilities. And so you can go on down the line there and see that all these agencies are very, very important, and they all have a responsibility within their own sectors to protect the assets of the United States against the threat of terrorist attacks. And these agencies all have what we would call critical infrastructure. Next slide. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the U.S. intelligence community, mission and challenges. Obviously, their mission is pretty unique. It's the collection and analysis of information and development of intelligence to protect the homeland. And it's in particular not only from domestic threats, but from external threats. A very difficult responsibility indeed. Let me just mention here, we also have an intelligence studies class in terrorism minor, and even if you don't major in the minor, it might be something that you're interested in taking. And I do this course both in a lecture and an online format. And when you look at our intelligence agencies and agencies involved in intelligence, we call them the intelligence community. They have the domestic and international needs, so we have to look at our domestic threats and our international threats to the homeland. The FBI has domestic responsibility for counterterrorism activities here in the United States. They collect information and intelligence, and they're also a law enforcement organization. The CIA has an international focus. We've talked about that in this class before, and that's their information. Their job is to collect information overseas and develop intelligence, looking at the external threat to the homeland, and also to our resources overseas and our footprint overseas. NSA, the National Security Agency, I think we've talked about them briefly, but they get involved in a lot of our technical interception of communications, that sort of thing. Very, very important agency, obviously. The DIA is the Defense Intelligence Agency, and that's it'd be like the CIA except for the Department of Defense. It's a coordination agency, and actually the Department of Defense gets most of the budget for intelligence in the nation because of its the size and scope of our military organizations. DIA, again, a coordination agency where all the different departments like the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Army, the Air Force, the Coast Guard, not the Coast Guard, but the Army, the Air Force have a seat at the table within there, and you also have, they work alongside civilians in developing important information relative to our Department of Defense. There's always challenges with coordination. People like to protect their own turf, protect the information they have for whatever reason, and this is one of the things that we have to always strive to try to overcome, is to break down those barriers where people do not want to cooperate. And we've come a long way in the last 13, 14 years since 9/11. There's an interesting case I want you to read about. We talk about cooperation on page 249, where they talk about Moroccan intelligence officers developing information from Al-Qaeda prisoner held at Guantanamo Bay. I'm not going to give it away to you, but I want you to look at that, because that's a great example of how I know there's a lot of criticism of Guantanamo Bay, but this is a situation where a captive that was in Guantanamo Bay was interrogated and this by Moroccan intelligence officers, and that information ultimately ended up probably saving U.S. lives. So read about that on page 249. Great story. Next slide. And this is just a quick snapshot of the 17 agencies. If you count the Director of National Intelligence, that's an organization, the Office of the Director. He's the coordinator for the intelligence community, and then there's the 16 agencies that belong, and you'll recognize many of them, all the military, agencies, and the NSA, and the CIA, and the FBI, and ATF, and Department of the Treasury, etc. They all have a seat at the table, including the Department of Homeland Security. Next slide. One thing about intelligence, too, and it's something you always have to talk about, is we are an open democratic society. Our forefathers rebelled against a very oppressive government in the British government, so when the Constitution was created, it was important that civil liberties be maintained for our citizens. And however, when you're dealing with intelligence, you're also dealing with secret information, so you have somewhat of a clash there. You have the clash of the need to protect information for national security and protect the homeland. At the same time, we have to respect the rights. So it's a very difficult balance when you're dealing about protecting the homeland, securing the homeland, and at the same time balancing civil liberties. We don't want to become a Gestapo state. We have to have those security procedures in place like we see at airports, but at the same time we don't want to make it so oppressive that people don't feel like they're living in an America as it was founded by our forefathers. Europe has gone through this. If you read about on page 250 and 251, you read about some of the good things that they've done in their work using quality detective work to deter and detect possible terrorist events, especially with groups like the Irish Republican Army. But at the same time, they talk about the Guildford 4 case and the Birmingham 6, and this is where law enforcement did a poor job, overextended their authorities, and individuals in these cases were actually convicted and sentenced to jail. In the Birmingham case on fabricated evidence. In the other case, they were imprisoned, but their cases were wrongly sentenced for a bombing attack that occurred in the Guildford 4. So this is where you get that clash between security and liberty, and sometimes government organizations, overextended their authorities. In the United States, we also have a history. We talk about the Red Scares, Red being the communist threat in the United States and the stages of that. If you look at World War II, the internment camps were Japanese Americans, nationals that were living in places like California, etc. at the time, where they had large Japanese American populations. They were actually placed in internment camps for the duration of the war. Many of them lost all their property, etc. as a result of this activity, and this is where when you look back on that, that seems to be a very, very poor choice of policy that the United States undertook in that particular. But again, when you're dealing with the fear that was created by Pearl Harbor, etc., you can somewhat understand the reaction of government at the time. Doesn't make it right, but it makes it a little bit more understandable. And always remember that our goals with Homeland Security: disrupt terrorist operations, deter those crossovers from where individuals evolve from extremism to terrorism. We want to create a cooperative counterterrorism environment amongst the organizations that are involved in the Homeland Security element of our governments. And we want to always minimize our human casualties and our physical destruction in the event that terrorists are successful. The best organizations are flexible, but at the same time they embrace liberty. Next slide. In this slide we're going to talk a little bit about terrorist profiling. Again, this is something that was criticized after 9/11, where terrorist profiles were established much like criminal profiles that we use on drug investigations, and where it leaned heavily towards people with Middle Eastern heritage, temporary visa status, Muslims, male gender, young adults, and many of them were stopped and held and interviewed, and as a result there were a lot of complaints filed because many of these people had nothing to do with it, and that's the problem when you get into profiling. Also talk about labeling the enemy, and this is some of the challenges that were impacted when you pick up individuals in foreign countries like Afghanistan that are fighting for the Taliban. Well, they don't actually represent a nation state, so do they really fit that the label of as being prisoners of war and entitled to the Geneva Convention? And these were the challenges that the United States faced, and we chose not to designate these people as prisoner of wars, as therefore, because if you're a prisoner of war, you're entitled to the same legal rights in the same courts as soldiers from the country holding them prisoner. And so that was the challenges that that came about with these terrorists, because we did not want to designate them, so we wanted to hold them as long as we could. And so then you got into labeling designations such as enemy combatants, unlawful combatants, and battlefield detainees. I'm not going to go into too much detail here other than to say that these are legal issues that we face today. We actually address these at great length in another course that I teach, Terrorism, Constitutional and Legal Issues. Another issue is extraordinary rendition. The old renditions that we're aware of is if a terrorist killed an American overseas and we're able to capture him in some manner, we can bring him back to the United States. It's called the Kerr-Frisbee rule. And the courts have found it to be legitimate. However, what happened after 9/11 was the expansion of what we call extraordinary rendition. And this is where if an individual was picked up in Afghanistan, turned over to the United States, we would then transport him to an allied country, let's say a place like Saudi Arabia, for interrogation. And this might be a country that allows enhanced interrogation techniques to be used. And usually the CIA had operatives who would carry out these interrogations. And this is a program that got a lot of negative publicity, not only from the individual countries where people that had been abducted, but also from other Western allied countries. And of course, like I talked about with torture, there's always a debate about the use of waterboarding and sexual degradation and stress positions, etc. These are some of the challenges that are faced whenever you're dealing with the interrogation of individuals like that. And obviously, the Abu Ghraib was a black mark on the public. It doesn't mean that that some of these enhanced interrogation techniques are not justified. Every person has to make their own justification, and the courts have ruled on these. But there's also information that's been put out that many of the enhanced interrogation techniques did produce information that was very useful to U.S. intelligence community and law enforcement. And of course, there'll be people that will challenge that. Next slide. And that ends this slide presentation.